they saw the lumber for the few camps that they made, and then they take it out to wherever the mill is going to be if they didn't have a car camp, and then build them out of lumber. Now this camp is actually from Buswell, which is on Papoose Lake, and the two people in there were actually, the one was a cook and his wife helped cook too, or maybe she did most of the cooking. But anyways, eventually when the logging was over, they moved into the Boulder Junction area, and their name was Klassen, and the two boys were adults when I got to Boulder back in '47, but so I never met the folks, but they had a grocery store in Boulder and stuff like that, and of course the lady did laundry. Now some of the other camps were just men there, they had a laundry too, but not a laundry, but they made they just have water from the lake that they could wash their clothes and hang them off. Now this is more typical. This is a Brooks and Ross camp, Camp 7, which was up north of, oh gosh, my memory is getting poor, so it probably don't matter where it was, but it was one of the Brooks and Ross. They had a mill down in Schofield, and they had quite a few camps from Boulder Junction north up to Upper Michigan, and all the logs went south by rail down to Schofield. Now here's one of Fosterville, one of their camps. Now some of the buildings are of course out of lumber that they made themselves. Now what this picture is must have been Mr. Foster at the time. He had a group of people coming up that were guests. There was either family guests or maybe who we were selling the lumber to downstate or whatever the case might be. And he had a couple flat cars that he loaded the people on with their canoes, and they made a canoe trip. Now I don't know if I have any canoe trip pictures on this set, but there were some over on one of these tables over here. Now here's one of their car camps, so where they had a main line, then they'd put in a spur, and they'd run the 4 to 6 cars that they needed, put them off so they'd be out of the way. Now this is actually a Winchester picture, and these shows, I didn't have a picture of the barns from Presque Isle, but Winchester at least had three horse barns on their rail camp. Here's the dining car from Foster's, and it would appear like there would be 50 or 60 men eating in this. This just shows a picture of a tree going down. And here, the tree had to be cut, of course, and then it was sawed into usually 16-foot lengths if they could get good diameter in the logs for 16 feet, and then especially in a mill where they had the mill close by, they'd also cut 8 foot and down to 8 foot and stuff. But generally, the stuff that went down the rivers was all 16 foot. Here's where they were skidding logs out of the wood. Sometimes they made timbers. They sawed timbers for themselves or for somebody else. A lot of places, especially, well, even in Presque Isle, they'd either drag the logs out by horse, or they'd occasionally sleigh them out to a certain place, and then they'd pile them alongside the railroad grade so that they could get loaded on cars. It was more common when they didn't have the mill close by, but because that's all they did, and they'd bring them out. Now this is a special load of logs, and you got to understand, in the old days there was 2 or 3 photographers that went from camp to camp, and they weren't so interested in the pictures themselves, except that they tried to get as many men as they could, or people on the picture, so that they could come back a week or 2 later and they'd sell them postcards. And so it's actually our best source of pictures is from old postcards and stuff. Well, this set of logs here was made in I think in Wisconsin, but it might have been Upper Michigan, and it was for one of the World's Fairs that was down in Chicago. And so they had a special logs that they were all. Well, I thought I had another picture here. Maybe it shows up a little later. All these logs were all big in diameter and all the same length and stuff. Now here's a more typical load of the railroads coming into the mill or to a place where they could dump them in the river. Now, this is actually not it's a steam engine, but it's called a Phoenix steam hauler, and they were originally made in Maine. It was the Lombard company then, and then when they ran out of timber in the East Coast, well, then they moved a manufacturing company down into Wisconsin, and then that outfit made them for Wisconsin and Minnesota and Michigan, and even some went down as far as Arkansas. Now they were tried out west, but generally the terrain was so steep that they weren't really practical in the out west to get to all this stuff. Another kind of tractor that they'd haul long sleighs out of the wood was the whole tractor company, and they were down in Wausau where they built them. Those were both gasoline or diesel engine, depending on each company. Now here's where a tractor went off with a grade somehow or other, got off to the side and got tipped over. And they had equipment that they could get it. It was a lot of work, but they had equipment to get it back onto the grade. Now this is where a lot of the stuff was hauled out by either sleigh or just skidded along the railroad grades. I think this is a Fosterville picture or Weininger, one or the other. Here's an extreme case. In later years, a lot of the stuff went as pulp. And so you see timber in the background that is obviously going to be pulp and not logs for sawn. Now Camp 3 again is another Brooks and Ross picture. That's up north of Dairyman's Country Club up there. Now they didn't really start until 1905, before the main railroad got to Boulder, and so they didn't do much logging until they knew that was coming. Now a bunch of these pictures are different things that happened at the same time. Now whether it happened here in Presque Isle or not, I don't know, but originally in downstate there was a lot more hemlock mixed with the pine and stuff, and early on when there was all kinds of timber to cut yet, they actually didn't even bother to make lumber out of the logs. The bark was what was important, and that would be made into 4-foot lengths and piled, and that was sold by the cord too. They'd cut the tree down primarily in the spring when the sap was first running, and then they'd measure off every 4 foot, and then they'd open it up, and then they could peel the bark off, because the bark was going to tanneries where it was ground up, and there was a natural tannin in that. Later on they got the tannins out of oil and that they get out of the ground and stuff, but early on it was all made out of primarily hemlock bark. Now here's again from Camp 3, which is north of Dairyman's, and they had a regular railroad spur went into that camp because that was one of their main camps, and a lot of they had tractors, Holt and Lombard tractors to bring the stuff in there that would save building a lot of railroad track. This is probably the same picture I had before. Well, then I didn't realize I had two of them the same. I thought I went over this before it came over, but I didn't go through it all, I guess. Now let's see. All right, I was just pushing the wrong button. That was my fault again. That happens all the time. Okay. Don't mind me. I'm just 82 years old, so I forget a lot of stuff. Anyways, this is where they were actually peeling bark, and then they actually piled it. And we did I did land surveying for the state later on, and when we were surveying in the Powell Marsh country, we found a number of bark piles that had already settled down to only 2 or 3 feet high, that apparently they missed, or they just didn't have enough to come back in for the last few piles and stuff. I wish we'd have taken a picture of it at the time, but we didn't. Now here it shows where they cut the tree down, and of course they peel the bark. Now the time they cut up here, they were also making hemlock into lumber, but it was sold for much. White pine and Norway pine were worth a lot more as lumber than the hemlock was. Now here's a pile of bark. They'd have the bark was 4 feet long, or maybe once in a while 8 feet long, and then they were piled 8 feet high, so it was sold by the cord, just like firewood was. Then when they slayed it out to get to the railroads, they had these slayed. Now bark didn't weigh very much, so that looks like an awful big. Oh, there's a man. They put in places where a man could stand halfway up, and then somebody would hand him the bark, and he'd hand it to the guy that was loading it across the top. In fact, they probably had two guys doing it at the same time on both sides. Sometimes, and then eventually it was loaded on railroad cars to get down to the tanneries. Here's at a mill someplace, I'm not even sure, it was in Wisconsin somewhere, but I'm not even sure where. And then as they needed it, they grind it up, and I don't know how long they had to soak it in water, but eventually they had a natural tannin that they took out of it. Now another thing that was done that was about the same time is there was a lot of cedar, and they'd make some cedar lumber, but most of the cedar went out they'd take the bark off, and it would go down to the mill and be cut into 14 or 16 inches lengths and made into shingles. Now, I'm not sure if Presque Isle had a shingle mill or not. And then they also, when they got to the smaller diameter stuff, they peeled the pieces, usually 6 or 8 feet or something like that, and then they were shipped out west and even to Wisconsin for fences and stuff. But you got to realize that out west there just wasn't much timber. They got some off the Black Hills, but then they didn't have any good timber until they actually got to the mountains out west, and so it was easier to ship it in from this end than there. And they also made ties for the railroads. And here's just a typical crew. It's probably a loading crew for railroad cars, because they have this thing on their shoulder. Two men would put a tie on top of their shoulder, one behind the other, and then they carried it up to the railroad cars, or sometimes they would use these tongs to get them inside the railroad car. A lot of them were put on flat cars and just slid on in that way. Now here's loading logs on railroad cars. There were a lot of different ways, but this was the easiest by far. They'd have horses drag them up to here along the grade, and where they were put on timbers that were laid lengthwise, and then when they would get the railroad car in there, then they'd have these 2 or 3 poles on there to be able to roll them up. These are probably only going to a mill close by, because they aren't loading them very, very high. They also had different rigs for loading logs on railroad cars. In this case, they had a horse that was hooked up to the cable, and he'd walk out. You can see him up ahead by the other railroad car, and then they drop it down, and then the man on top would fit it up to make a good load out of it, and then the horse would back up all the way to pick up another log. They also had a lot of different steam rigs that would load cars like this. Again, this is probably mostly all for a mill. Now you can see some pretty small logs in the pile especially, but I've cut a lot of log ends. When they used to float them down the river, they'd mark the ends of the logs with a mark, and then they sometimes on the round part they put a bark mark. But I've seen logs, 16-foot logs in the rivers that I pulled out to cut the ends off, that were no bigger than 4 to 6 inches. Not many 4s, but 6 and beyond. It was quite often you'd find them that size. Now here's a Vilas County Lumber Company rig. Now this was a rig that could run on the rails. You can see the railroad wheels on top there, and they'd get up to wherever they want to load logs, and then they lower these 4 legs to put the machine up in the air a little bit, and they could pull the